Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining what's now the second ADHD Remapped webinar. So today's topic is on the ADHD brain, wired for curiosity. I'm Matthew Menzies. I know some faces from last time and also people I've chatted to over the last few weeks. I'm the founder of ADHD Remapped, and I'm an ADHD coach and training facilitator. So just to let you know that I'll be recording today's session and it'll go up on YouTube in a few days' time. So if you don't want to be on the recording, feel free to keep your camera off. And if you do have questions at the end, maybe put them in the chat box rather than coming onto screen if you prefer. So today's session is about curiosity in principle, and some of the things that we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at a brief overview of my ADHD journey and my late diagnosis and my school life and work life and how things have changed since. Then we're going to look at why a strengths-based approach is so important and where that negative kind of bias and that rumination can really hinder you, and using the strengths-based approach, you can kind of find a way forward. Then we'll look at distractibility versus curiosity, and from an external perspective and an internal perspective. And then we'll finish with a topic that is a favorite of mine, situational variability. And then we'll look at the gold standard for ADHD support. And we'll finish with a Q&A session. These sessions typically are 30 to 40 minutes, a nice kind of like ADHD friendly period of time. And then by the end of the session, I hope you'll be able to reflect on how looking through a positive ADHD lens can reframe your own understanding of ADHD, whether that's of your own or of somebody else's ADHD. So a brief kind of summary of my journey to where I am right now. So I'm 42 years old this year, diagnosed at 39. Born and raised in Manchester predominantly. I went to school in Manchester, and school life was quite difficult, which is not uncommon with ADHDers. Very early on was kind of like labelled as disruptive and a naughty child, and didn't try hard enough, and kind of couldn't get my times tables, or learned to write very late and struggled with reading, and was just always told that I just needed to be better. That was like the common theme, and in high school that really kind of like amplified, and I was very disruptive. I was bored. I was staring out of classroom windows. I was never really paying attention to what was going on, and that resulted in a lot of external negative feedback. You're naughty, you're bad, you don't try hard enough, you're not good enough. And that then kind of turns into internal kind of feedback, doesn't it? You start telling yourself that as well. So school life was tough, and I was really lucky. After I left school when I was 17, I joined the RAF, and that was a life-changing moment for me in terms of looking back, realizing that structure and discipline was really key, and it was not something that I had outside of that. And it was the first time I realized that I had a little belief in myself, and I thought, actually, I can achieve great things given the right environment. And environment is what we'll talk about with situational variability later. I left the RAF to go to university, and through like university and working life, I just always felt like a little different. I knew I was relatively smart, like I did an engineering degree, I became an engineer, but my working memory was so bad. I would always struggle to remember formula, or struggle to remember why I walked into a room. Like, just, it was so shocking, and it really made me just feel like I didn't deserve to be there. I didn't deserve to be on this engineering degree. I didn't deserve to be an engineer in a room with all these people who seem to find this really easy. And a lot of difficult kind of like emotional regulation, particularly around like friendships and relationships. And I was on the BBC a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke about this whole cycle of career changes and successes, and then big crashes with like really bad mental health crisis. And I talk about that quite a lot elsewhere as well. And the main turning point for me becoming diagnosed was becoming a dad. So parenthood brought a huge number of challenges. As beautiful as my children are, my stress and my worry and my anxiety just like blew up at that point, and I went into a really bad state of depression. This was kind of during and after COVID as well, so it all kind of coincided together, where we like structure and routine and we like new and exciting, but COVID stripped both of those things away from us. And then I had parenthood to that at the same time. And it was just emotionally and mentally for me, it was a real difficult time. But then that led me to see a therapist. And that's where the suggestion of a diagnosis came in. I was talking about finding something that will bring me calm and relaxation. And I was talking about reading, like how sometimes I can read a book and like the pages flow and I really love it. I'm calm and I can sit there for hours. But then other times the words just bounce around the page. Like I literally read a paragraph and completely forget, try and read a page, completely forget. Sometimes I can't literally get the words to stand still. And I thought I was dyslexic. But then she said, well, it doesn't make sense that it'd be dyslexia because you've got two different kind of scenarios there that have a completely different outcome. And if you had dyslexia, then the content wouldn't make any difference to how you experience that reading. And she said, have you ever considered that you might have ADHD? And like, I just did not, I'd never considered it in my life. I taught for a few years and so I worked with children with ADHD, and my idea was this whole misconception of kind of like naughty boy can't sit still, and that was never really me. So anyway, she sends me the ASRS form, the ADHD self-report scale, and it was like tick, 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 tick. Like every single item was just like, yeah, that's me, that's me. And I kind of explored an NHS diagnosis. I think we all know this. By now, like that NHS waiting times are years and years in some areas. And I ended up going private in the end. And I was lucky enough to be able to do that. And after I'd kind of like gone through that whole experience of like emotional, like roller coaster ride during and after diagnosis, I'd kind of had this whole like relief, but then anger and loss and resentment and complex kind of like series of emotions. And I just realized that now it was for me to decide what's next. And I went and sought a coach of my own and completely changed how I saw myself. I'd gone through life having all of this external input that was telling me that I wasn't good enough. And that turned into internal feedback that I'm just not good enough. I'm just not smart enough, or just don't do things right. And that's where this whole like strength-based approach comes in with my experience as a coachee. And so if we look at that feedback that we get externally, that then turns into negative self-talk. And this negative self-talk is kind of like, it's just this constant telling yourself you're not good enough. And that turns into rumination, which is that relentless cycle of those words flying around in your mind and literally like that kind of like noise that we can experience. And those negative thought patterns really dominate your mind. So there's an area of your brain called the reticular activating system, the RAS. That's like the gatekeeper of thoughts, if you like, and it only lets the strongest, most intense thoughts through. Now, because of our history with that negative input and internal feedback, those are the strongest thoughts in our mind, and so those are the ones that go through the RAS, and those are the ones that keep cycling. And there's this saying in kind of like ADHD world of what we pay attention to grows. And it's like, if you keep telling yourself you're not good enough, you're just going to feel less and less useful and less whole and complete. And that kind of like is just an endless cycle and grows and snowballs until it can become unmanageable. And that's certainly what happened to me. But through coaching, I was kind of able to find strengths within areas that I'd never really seen them before. And so we kind of like looked at things like where I was now. So like how is ADHD impacting me right now? And what are the kind of like core strengths and beliefs and values that I hold dear? And looked at kind of like previous experiences where actually like DRF, for example, like the successes I had there were fantastic. And what was it about that situation? And looking back, it was the routine and the structure, it was the environment that worked for me. And then building on what you do well. So taking that and implementing it in activities within your life where you do struggle and find things difficult. And and it's not just about coming away with like a list of actions with coaching. It's very emotional based as well. Like for me, I found that in the situations where I was finding things difficult, it was basically my emotions, almost like I'm scared to do it wrong, and that I'm scared to try and for it not to work, and I'm scared of upsetting someone. So I'd have that social anxiety, and learning those things about myself emotionally really helped me to then be able to take action and kind of move forward. And it was basically about offering this alternative to negative self-talk. And same as what we said earlier, like this, what you pay attention to grows. And so during that period of time, focusing on the positives and focusing on the strengths, like over and over again, day after day, week after week, like that is what grew until eventually that is then the strongest thought. And that's what gets through the RES. And that's what you start telling yourself. And it's not once you get there, that's it. But there are good days and bad days, but it's about knowing that you have that within yourself, and you have that power and that strength within yourself. So onto the main topic for today. So I was chatting to a colleague, a friend and colleague recently, about ADHD and childhood. And he was saying to me that when he was little, his mum used to tell people, like, if you talk to him and an ant's walking by, you better believe he's watching the ant and not listening to what you're saying. So if you just completely missed everything I just said, you've probably got ADHD, although you probably have if you're on this call anyway. But it just got me thinking about what is seen externally by others as distractibility could actually, in a lot of cases, be curiosity. And distractibility kind of tends to be linked with negative, whereas we can view curiosity as a real strength, and we can use it to our advantage. So distractibility can be categorized into internal and external. So external examples are things like sensory inputs like sound and movement and light and smell and touch and that sort of thing. So for example, if I'm out at a cafe and it's a busy day and I'm trying to have a one-on-one conversation with you, like I'm absorbing so much of what's around me, the light, the sound, other people's conversations, spoons on cups. And so my mind is really using up so much energy to try and filter that out that it's really hard to kind of have this one-on-one conversation with you. And that really kind of struggle to filter. And that's the external examples. And research tends to be on the external, and actually that whole external distractions is a diagnostic criteria in the ADHD assessment. But then you have two types of internal distractibility as well. So for example, like intrusive thoughts is an internal distractibility, and that's what we spoke about earlier with that whole negative self-talk and rumination, and often can be kind of like simulating negative feedback from others. So just bear with me a second. I'm going to mute because I think a couple of people are. Okay, there we go. The second internal distractibility is this spontaneous mind wandering. So these are internally within your imagination, if you like. And these can be like images and thoughts and voices and even like feelings, emotions, and they're produced spontaneously within the brain in the absence of external stimulus. And that's the really important bit, is that in the absence of external stimulus. So we have an interest-based brain, not an importance-based brain. So like if what you're saying isn't particularly interesting and there's nothing directly interesting for us to observe around us, like we could disappear within our minds and be enjoying ourselves there much more than listening to you tell us what we should be doing right now. And basically that's kind of, if you imagine being a school child and you're being spoken to at the front of the classroom, like these are the steps to do this task. And for me, I was the one that was gazing out the window, kind of like either watching nature or just imagining things that in my mind were so much more interesting than what I could see and hear in front of me. And while I was doing that, my ears literally were like, it's not like I'm not listening. I literally can't hear you. Like my mind is so absorbed in what's going on up here. And so that brings me on to curiosity. So curiosity is a kind of internal motivation only. So it's kind of our tendency to like recognize and seek new information and experience around us, and within our mind, and it's driven internally. And it's not, you can't define curiosity as something that you have to learn through external motivation. So like if you have to learn a topic for an essay and it's not naturally something that you would be trying to learn, that's not necessarily curiosity. That is, it's an external motivation, so it doesn't come under that classification. But then that curiosity is split into three different types. So you have diversive, which is this like short-lived desire to explore knowledge and information. And this is from a very, very young age, you know, kind of like, what does that toy do? Or what does that button do? Or what happens when I grab this as a small child? It's very high level. And it's basically kind of like childhood through to adulthood. So there's not any real like depth within that level of curiosity. The second one, which a lot of ADHDs will be familiar with as an experience, is epistemic, which is cognitive. And so that is like this strong urge to eliminate information gaps in our understanding. This is that whole like real kind of like deep dive rabbit hole level of curiosity where you literally can get lost for kind of like days, hours, weeks. You know, if you're doing a PhD, you might be gone, you might be deeply kind of like curious for years at a time. And then the third is social. So that kind of like empathic curiosity, which is basically about learning about how other people think and feel. And it's a complicated one with ADHD, that one, because you can experience quite high levels of dopamine through being kind of like sat calm and relaxed in a room full of people where you're demonstrating curiosity. But we can often have a lot of social anxiety with ADHD, and a lot of like that revolves around the RSD, and so it's a bit more of a complex one than with kind of neurotypicals. So where does that kind of link into ADHD then? So we have this whole kind of link between dopamine and ADHD and curiosity, and we often see dopamine as being like this reward hormone, which it is, but it's also released when we experience curiosity, and then also released when we actually fulfill some of that curiosity. And so you have this kind of this cycle of curiosity fuels dopamine, fuels curiosity, fuels dopamine. And obviously, since us ADHDers have quite low levels of dopamine, typically, like this kind of like can cycle us into quite a deep state of hyper focus where we just get lost for days and hours on end. And so if you consider again this child sat at his desk staring at the window, the teacher at the front is like, why aren't you listening? Like, you're just distracted staring out the window. But actually, that child is maybe imagining a story and becomes a writer, or is watching nature and you know becomes someone who studies nature when they're older. It's from the external looking towards, it looks like a negative and it looks like something that is something to be solved. But it's for me, such an exceptional characteristic, such an exceptional trait to be curious in that way. And when we're provided with the right environment, you know, it's kind of, that's where we thrive. So for me, you look at curiosity and it can massively improve learning if the interest levels are kept at the right state. And so this is where, whether you're a teacher or a parent or even you know, in employment, it's about maintaining interest in order to maintain that level of curiosity, which then stimulates learning to a really high intense level. Curious people tend to be happier. So low levels of anxiety and higher satisfaction with overall well-being is recorded and within research around curiosity. And if you think about how that works within relationships and friendships, if you have someone who is really curious about you as a human being and how you work and how you operate, that's really a really strong way to make human connections with people. And so it's really good with relationship building, although it can be overused. And I know some ADHDers can kind of go above and beyond that and maybe actually be a bit intrusive at times. But yeah, if it's used in the right way, it's amazing. It's an amazing skill. Also, increased creativity is associated with high levels of curiosity. And I know a large percentage of highly creative people are neurodivergent. That conceptual expansion and divergent thinking that we can have as neurodivergents, if you then drive that with high levels of curiosity, is kind of you leading towards a huge level of creativity. Again, go back to if in the right environment, in the right situation. And one of my favorite people of all time, but particularly favorite, although he wasn't diagnosed, favorite ADHD, Albert Einstein says that I have no special interests. I'm only passionately curious. And I really love that because I think that was what always drove my love of learning, was just really wanting to know, like, oh, okay, like, but what next? Or, but then what happens? Why does that happen? And it just created a real passion for learning, and that's something I think I will always hold. And so the point of distractibility versus curiosity is, as I said earlier, it's about how you frame it. And from the outside looking in, it might look like a negative, but if we can learn about why we do these things and use them to our advantage, then they become a huge strength. And as we know with ADHD, this whole thing around interest versus importance, and if we're able to capture our interest and merge that with curiosity, then that's where our minds can thrive to fantastic levels. And that environment change is what brings me on to situational variability. So as I said earlier, the ADHD brain is interest-based, not importance-based. That's Dr. Tom Brown's kind of description of the ADHD brain. So basically, that means high levels of interest, high levels of attention, low levels of interest, low levels of attention. And a lot of people have seen the term hyperfocus, and that's really common. Maybe a few less people will have seen the term hypofocus. Hyperfocus is that intense state of focus and concentration for long periods of time, sometimes to the point where like you can forget to eat and drink or go to the toilet. Hypofocus is a little different, and it's the complete opposite. It's like intense difficulty in holding concentration or attention, even just for really like short amounts of time. Hypofocus state is like, for me, can feel like there's literally something physical or between me and what needs to be done. And it can feel like an impossible situation. And it might be that it's just to do something really simple. And what's really important for people to understand, for yourself and for others, is that it's this whole kind of like won't versus can't, right? So it's not that we won't do something, it's that there's this physical or emotional barrier between us and the task. And it's, you know, like, why don't you just tidy your room? And it's like, well, like I literally feel like I can't, like I don't know how to organize, or I don't know where to begin. And it's like I can see everything. You might be able to see like, okay, start with that box, but in my mind it's so overwhelming, and that's where that hypo-focus state can come in. And I always like to kind of find strengths in all of the topics that I discuss. And so we talk about adapting your environment. So for me, when I write reports, I used to, till I was 39, sit at a desk and just my mind would feel completely stifled, and I wouldn't be able to find the words that I needed. And it could take me days to write something that probably, you know, typically should have only taken a couple of hours. But what I've learned about myself is that I'm a conceptual thinker, and that I love nature. And so for me, what I'll do is I'll stand in front of a whiteboard and I'll map out my thoughts and ideas. Take a photograph of that, phone in pocket, earphones on, and I'll go for a walk by the river. And what I'll do is I'll use that mind map and I'll dictate into my phone, into speech to text thing on my phone, the whole report. And it'll need a little bit of editing when I get home, but I'll be out there for an hour or two and literally the words flow, my mind is in that flow state. I'm in an area, an environment that works for me. It makes my mind quiet. I'm less distracted. And the output is that I have a report at the end and I'm not emotionally drained. And it's only taken me 2 or 3 hours, not 3 days. And I'm not completely overwhelmed and I'm not on the verge of burnout. And so that's, for me personally, finding an environment to do the same task with completely different levels of productivity, but most importantly, a completely different intensity of energy draining. And that burnout is so important for us to be able to manage as ADHDers. Then the next strength-based approach is this idea of resparkleize. So that is a term that I learned from Barbara Luther at ADCA, where I did my coach training. Fantastic coach and coach trainer. So this is where you add something interesting to a task that probably hasn't got much interest. So like for me, like housework, like cleaning the kitchen or washing the dishes is boring and I really don't want to do it. And every time I would do it, it's like, I hate this. And so the next time you remember that you hated it last time and that just kind of compounds the issue. But add a little music and have a little dance around while I'm doing it. It's like, actually, yeah, I'm quite enjoying this. And then like the next time, like, yeah, this is great. It's kind of like building and building. And then it's creating an environment to do the same task where it just lights up your interest a little. And then it makes life much more easier. And that whole overwhelm and the emotional drain kind of like is more manageable. The third thing around situational variability, and it's such, I want to do some more studying around this, but it's such a fascinating topic around body doubling. And if you haven't heard about body doubling before, it's where you can have basically do a task with somebody in the space with you, and that could be physically or it could be virtually. And it's basically just having someone there, not even a conversation, it's just that they're present. And there's something about this that then makes what tasks we may find difficult to make them feel a lot easier. And actually, as a teacher, I used to do this without realizing at the time why it helped. I've set up like a weekly planning and marking session where teachers would just come and sit in the room quietly and do their own work in the space. And I never understood why it always worked and I was more productive. But now I look back and it's like, okay, so I was body doubling before I even knew what that was. So then that brings me on to the last slide before we get to the Q&A. And so, yeah, the kind of recognized gold standard of ADHD support. And I've added some extra details around this just from conversations I've had recently. There are 3 kind of core areas, and education is the first. So this is about kind of going out and learning as much as you can about ADHD as a whole and where that fits within your life and your kind of situation. There's a lot of misinformation online, so you do have to be careful if you're using social media particularly. Always like verify the information you hear and make sure you're kind of like finding a reputable source. The second one, and again, this isn't for everybody, but the second within this kind of trio is medication. And so diagnosis and medication is helpful for quite a lot of people. And CHAD, the Child and Adults with ADHD website, say that up to 80% of adults particularly get a real kind of like moderate to large improvements on kind of core ADHD symptoms. I don't like the term symptoms, but that's the wording they use. And then the final of the 3 is coaching or CBT. For me, I use coaching, but you can use one or the other. And then what I've added to this myself recently is often during coaching, there are things that we can look at holistically that kind of complete that that support network, and that's looking at things like where nutrition and exercise and meditation can kind of help and support. But any questions from anybody?